In the turbulent spring of 1865, as the Civil War ground to its bloody conclusion, and as the 13th Amendment officially abolished slavery throughout the United States, a 7-year-old black girl in rural Georgia began to demonstrate abilities that would challenge every assumption that white society held about black intelligence, about human memory, and about the limits of what a child's mind could accomplish. Her name was Sarah Brown, and she possessed what modern psychology would call eidetic or photographic memory, the ability to recall images, texts, sounds, and experiences with perfect accuracy after only brief exposure, as if her mind could take photographs of everything she encountered and store them permanently for later retrieval with complete fidelity. Sarah was born in 1858 on a plantation in Wilkes County, Georgia, to parents who had been enslaved since birth. Her mother, Harriet Brown, worked as a house servant in the plantation's main house, a position that was considered relatively privileged compared to field work, but that came with its own forms of exploitation and danger, particularly for enslaved women who were vulnerable to sexual violence from white men who had absolute power over their bodies. Her father, whose name was never recorded in any surviving documents, was believed to have been one of the field workers on the same plantation, though some whispered that he might have been a white overseer. A common enough occurrence in a system where enslaved women had no ability to refuse sexual advances from men who held power over their lives. Sarah's early childhood was spent in the brutal final years of slavery, a time when the institution was under increasing pressure from the war, but when its daily violence and dehumanization continued unabated for those who remained in bondage. The plantation where she lived was smaller than the massive cotton operations in the deeper South, focusing primarily on food crops and livestock that supplied Confederate armies. But the conditions were harsh, and the discipline was severe as plantation owners and overseers struggled to maintain control over an enslaved population that knew that freedom might be coming, and that showed increasing resistance to the regime that held them. Before we continue this powerful story, if you believe the memory of our people must never be erased, write in the comments where you're watching from and subscribe so our community can grow and our voice can become even stronger. Now, we return to the story of Sarah Brown, the girl with a photographic memory. When Union forces moved through Georgia in late 1864 and early 1865, during Sherman's march to the sea, and then northward through the Corollas, the social order of slavery began to collapse even before legal emancipation. Enslaved people fled plantations when Union troops approached, sought protection with Northern armies, or simply stopped working and began acting as free people even before the law recognized their freedom. The plantation where Sarah lived experienced this collapse. Many of the enslaved workers fled. The white family abandoned the property temporarily, and the remaining black people were left in a state of uncertain freedom. No longer enslaved in practice, but not yet legally free and with no resources or infrastructure to support them. When emancipation came officially in 1865, Sarah was 7 years old enough to have clear memories of slavery, old enough to have experienced its trauma and witnessed its violence, but young enough that her development and education would be shaped primarily by the new, if deeply imperfect, reality of freedom. Harriet and Sarah remained in Wilkes County like many newly freed people who had nowhere else to go, and who lacked the resources to migrate to other regions where opportunities might be better. They moved to Washington, Georgia, the county seat, where a settlement of freed black people had quickly formed as former slaves clustered together for mutual support, protection, and the hope of building new lives. Life in Washington in 1865-1866 was precarious and difficult for freed black people. Employment was scarce and poorly paid when it could be found at all. White residents were hostile to black freedom and to black presence in the town, using violence and intimidation to try to drive black people out or to force them back into labor arrangements that resembled slavery in everything but name. The Freedmen's Bureau, the federal agency tasked with assisting formerly enslaved people in the transition to freedom, had minimal presence in the area and minimal resources to help the thousands of people who desperately needed assistance with food, shelter, employment, education, and protection from violence. Harriet found work as a laundress and as a domestic servant for white families, earning barely enough to keep herself and her daughter alive in a one-room cabin in the black settlement. She worked long hours, often from before dawn until after dark, doing the back-breaking labor of washing clothes by hand, carrying heavy loads of wet laundry, heating water over open fires regardless of the season or the weather. It was brutal work that destroyed her health and left her exhausted and aged beyond her years. But she endured it because she was determined that Sarah would have opportunities that slavery had denied. Opportunities that would give her daughter a life different from and better than the one Harriet had known. The most important opportunity, the one that represented hope and dignity and future possibility for freed black people, was education. During slavery, it had been illegal in most southern states to teach enslaved people to read and write. Literacy was understood by both enslaved and enslavers as dangerous, as a form of power that threatened the control slavery depended upon. Enslaved people who could read might read abolitionist literature, might forge passes to escape, might communicate with each other in ways that overseers couldn't monitor. So literacy was criminalized and violently suppressed, with enslaved people caught learning to read, facing brutal punishments, whippings, mutilation, sale away from family, and with anyone caught teaching them facing legal penalties and social ostracism. But with emancipation came an explosion of hunger for education among freed people. Adults who had been denied literacy, their entire lives sought to learn. Parents were desperate to ensure their children had the education they had been denied. Learning to read and write was understood not just as practical skill, but as claiming humanity, as exercising freedom, as accessing power that had been violently withheld. Black communities organized schools despite having almost no resources. Meeting in churches and homes and any available space, teaching with whatever materials could be screed or donated. Learning by candle light and firelight when work obligations prevented daytime attendance. In Washington, education for black children was dangerous and nearly impossible to access in the immediate aftermath of emancipation. White society violently opposed black literacy, viewing educated black people as threats to the racial hierarchy that was supposed to replace slavery as the organizing principle of Southern society. Schools for black children were burned. Teachers were threatened and sometimes killed. Students were harassed and attacked. But despite these dangers, black communities and northern missionaries persisted in creating educational opportunities, driven by the understanding that education was essential to freedom and to the possibility of building better futures. Harriet enrolled Sarah in one of these makeshift schools in late 1865, a few months after emancipation. The school was held in a small wooden church that the black community had built quickly after freedom came, using scavenged materials and donated labor, creating a structure that served as place of worship on Sundays and as schoolhouse on weekday evenings. The teacher was a young black woman named Martha Williams, who had been born free in the North and who had been educated by Quaker missionaries committed to black education. Martha had come south after the war as part of the wave of idealistic Northern teachers who believed that education could help freed people claim full citizenship and could help build a more just society in the South. Classes were held by candle light and firelight after sunset, when students who worked during the day could attend. Most of Martha's students were adults and older children who had never been allowed to learn during slavery, and who were learning basic literacy as adults slowly and with great difficulty. But she also had younger children like Sarah who were beginning their education without the burden of years spent being told they couldn't learn, who approached literacy with the natural enthusiasm and quick learning that children bring to new skills. It was in Martha Williams's classroom in the winter of 1865-1866 that Sarah's extraordinary memory first became obvious and undeniable to observers beyond her own family. Martha was teaching basic literacy. The alphabet, simple words, the connections between letters and sounds that are the foundation of reading. She used slates and chalk when she could get them. Wrote letters and words on scraps of paper that students would practice copying. Read aloud from the few books available, primarily Bibles and spelling primers donated by Northern charitable organizations. Most of her students were learning slowly and with difficulty, as anyone would when starting from complete illiteracy, and when able to attend school only sporadically because of work obligations, and when learning by inadequate light, with inadequate materials, and when exhausted from long days of labor. Adults who had spent their entire lives being told they couldn't learn often struggled with the basics, not because they lacked intelligence, but because learning is harder when you're older. And when decades of being denied education have convinced you that you're incapable of intellectual achievement. But Sarah was different in ways that Martha had never encountered in her several years of teaching. After a single lesson on the alphabet, Sarah could recite all 26 letters forward and backward without error, could identify each letter by sight, could write each letter from memory. After one reading of a simple Bible passage, Sarah could recite it word for word, maintaining the exact wording and punctuation, and even the rhythm and cadence that Martha had used when reading aloud. When Martha wrote words on the slate board and then erased them, Sarah could tell her exactly what had been written and where each word had been positioned on the board, as if she were still looking at the slate, even though it had been erased. It was as if Sarah's mind was capturing everything she saw and heard with perfect fidelity, and storing it permanently for instant and complete recall. Martha initially thought Sarah must have been secretly educated before coming to her school, despite the legal prohibitions on teaching enslaved people to read. Perhaps Harriet had been literate and had taught her daughter in secret, or perhaps someone else on the plantation had taken the risk of teaching Sarah. But when Martha asked Harriet about this, the response was unequivocal. Sarah had never been taught anything before coming to the school. Harriet herself was completely illiterate, had never been allowed to learn during slavery, had no way to teach her daughter, even if she had wanted to risk the brutal punishments that would have followed if they had been caught. Sarah's abilities were as surprising and mysterious to her mother as they were to her teacher. To test whether Sarah's abilities were as extraordinary as they appeared, Martha began showing her increasingly complex materials. Longer Bible passages, pages from geography books and histories, mathematical tables, anything she could find among the limited materials available. And Sarah could reproduce all of it from memory after a single brief viewing. When shown a page of text for just a few seconds, Sarah could recite the entire page word for word, maintaining the line breaks and paragraph structure as if she were reading from the page, even though it was no longer in front of her, and even though she had seen it only briefly. When shown a map, even a complex map showing multiple countries or states with rivers and mountains and cities marked, she could draw it from memory with remarkable accuracy, reproducing the shapes and relative positions, and even small details like decorative borders and compass roses, and the specific fonts used for labels. When shown a drawing or illustration from a book, she could reproduce it with impressive fidelity to the original, capturing not just the main elements, but small details of shading and proportion and perspective that most people wouldn't notice consciously, or wouldn't remember even if they did notice them. When Martha read her lists of random information, strings of numbers, series of unrelated words, sequences of dates and names, Sarah could repeat them back perfectly, could recall them hours or days later, could recite them forward or backward or starting from any point in the sequence. Martha Williams was both amazed by and troubled by what she was witnessing. Sarah's abilities were extraordinary and clearly represented intellectual capacity that was exceptional by any standard. This was evidence that directly contradicted every racist theory about black intellectual inferiority that white society used to justify slavery and continued oppression. If a 7-year-old black girl with no formal education and no access to books or resources could demonstrate memory abilities that exceeded what university-educated white adults could achieve, then the entire edifice of scientific racism and claims about natural racial hierarchies was exposed as the lie it had always been. But Martha also understood that Sarah's gifts would make her a target in the violent and unstable context of Reconstruction-era Georgia. Exceptional abilities in a black child would draw attention, would create interest among whites who might want to study her or exploit her, or who might feel threatened by evidence of black genius that challenged their worldview. In a time and place where black success and black excellence were seen as threats to white supremacy, Sarah's perfect memory could bring danger rather than opportunity. Martha consulted with other members of the black community, with ministers and teachers and elders who had experience navigating the dangers of being black in the South, who understood the delicate calculations required to survive in a society that was nominally free, but was actually structured to maintain white domination through violence and intimidation. The consensus was clear and unanimous. Sarah's abilities should be kept as quiet as possible. She should be taught and encouraged and given every opportunity to develop her gifts, but she should not be displayed publicly or talked about outside the black community. The community needed to protect her from the attention that might otherwise destroy her. This protective secrecy lasted only a few months before circumstances forced Sarah's gifts into public visibility in ways that would change her life permanently, and that would create one of the most disturbing and least known cases of exploitation and suppressed genius in Reconstruction history. In the spring of 1866, a white physician named Dr. Charles Morrison came to Washington, Georgia, as part of a Freary Edmunds Bureau mission to assess the health and living conditions of newly freed black people in the region. Dr. Morrison was from Pennsylvania, had served as a Union Army surgeon during the war, and considered himself sympathetic to black people and supportive of their advancement, though his sympathy was paternalistic and condescending, and was mixed with scientific racism and assumptions about black inferiority that were nearly universal among white people of his era, even those who opposed slavery and supported emancipation. Dr. Morrison's work with the Freary Edmunds Bureau involved conducting basic medical examinations of freed people, documenting living conditions and health problems, and writing reports that were supposed to help the Bureau determine what resources and assistance were needed in different areas. As part of this work, he visited the black settlement in Washington where Sarah and Harriet lived, examining people who had various ailments and injuries and chronic conditions that resulted from years of slavery's brutal treatment of black bodies. During his visit to Washington, Dr. Morrison happened to observe one of Martha Williams' evening classes in the church. Curious about the educational efforts that Northern missionaries and black communities were making, and wanting to see for himself how freed people were responding to educational opportunities, he witnessed Sarah demonstrating her memory abilities, reciting long Bible passages after single readings, reproducing maps and diagrams from memory, answering questions about materials she had seen only briefly. Dr. Morrison was stunned by what he observed and immediately recognized that he was witnessing something extraordinary that warranted further investigation and documentation from a medical and scientific perspective. He approached Harriet Brown and asked permission to examine Sarah more thoroughly, to conduct systematic tests of her memory abilities, to document what appeared to be an unprecedented case of eidetic memory in a child. Harriet was deeply reluctant. She understood intuitively that allowing white authorities to study her daughter was dangerous, that Sarah might become a spectacle, might be taken away from her, might be exploited in ways that Harriet couldn't prevent or control. She had lived her entire life understanding that white interest in black people was never benign, that white attention brought danger, that anything that made a black person exceptional or different or valuable in white eyes could lead to exploitation or worse. But Dr. Morrison was persuasive, and he had authority as a Freary Edmonds Bureau representative. He assured Harriet that Sarah would be treated respectfully, that the examination would be brief, and would be conducted locally rather than requiring Sarah to travel anywhere, that the knowledge gained would benefit not just science, but would provide evidence of black intellectual capacity that could help the cause of racial equality and black advancement. He promised that Sarah wouldn't be harmed, that Harriet could be present during all examinations, that no one would take Sarah away from her mother. He framed his interest as benevolent and scientific rather than exploitative, and in the context of 1866, when the Freary Edmonds Bureau represented federal authority, and when refusing white requests was dangerous for black people, regardless of what rights emancipation was supposed to have granted, Harriet felt she had little choice but to agree. Over the following weeks in spring 1866, Dr. Morrison conducted extensive testing of Sarah's memory abilities using whatever materials he could find or create. He would show her pages from medical textbooks, the only books he had access to, and ask her to recite them. He would draw complex anatomical diagrams and ask her to reproduce them hours or days later. He would read her lists of random words or numbers or dates and test her recall after various delays. He would show her photographs and illustrations and then ask her to describe them in detail or to draw what she had seen. Sarah's performance was consistent and remarkable across all of these tests. She could recall text with perfect accuracy, reproducing not just the content and meaning, but the exact wording, punctuation, capitalization, even typographical errors or unusual formatting. She could reproduce images with impressive fidelity, capturing details of shading, proportion, perspective, and composition that most people wouldn't notice consciously. She could remember lists of random information, strings of numbers, series of unrelated words, sequences of nonsense syllables with perfect accuracy, even after delays of hours or days. Her recall seemed to be truly photographic, as if she were reading from or looking at internal images of material she had seen previously, rather than reconstructing memories from abstracted or processed information the way most people do. Dr. Morrison was meticulous in his testing and documentation, conducting experiments designed to rule out alternative explanations for Sarah's abilities. He tested whether she might be using memory techniques or tricks rather than genuinely having eidetic recall. He tested whether her abilities were specific to certain types of material or whether they extended across all forms of information. He tested whether her recall degraded over time or remained perfect indefinitely. In every case, the results confirmed that Sarah possessed genuine eidetic memory of a kind that was extremely rare and that exceeded anything Dr. Morrison had encountered in his medical career or had read about in medical literature. He documented his findings in detailed reports that he sent to medical journals in Philadelphia and Boston, describing Sarah as a Negro child of approximately 8 years who demonstrates memory abilities that exceed anything previously documented in medical or psychological literature. He noted that Sarah's recall was not merely excellent, but appears to be truly eidetic or photographic in nature, suggesting that her mind captures and stores sensory information with perfect fidelity, rather than processing and abstracting it in the manner typical of human memory. He speculated about possible neurological mechanisms that might account for her abilities, though with the primitive understanding of brain function that existed in 1866, his theories were necessarily vague and largely wrong. But Dr. Morrison's scientific interest quickly transformed into something more troubling and more exploitative. He recognized that Sarah's case could bring him professional recognition and prestige. Medical journals would publish articles about such an extraordinary case. Universities might invite him to present his findings. His name would be associated with the discovery and documentation of unprecedented human abilities. This could advance his career significantly, could establish his reputation beyond the relatively modest achievements of being a Union Army surgeon and Freedmen's Bureau doctor. He also recognized that Sarah could be profitable in more direct ways. White audiences would pay to see the Negro child with perfect memory. Demonstrations of her abilities could generate income that Dr. Morrison could keep for himself, while paying Harriet only token amounts or nothing at all. In a time and place where black people had minimal legal rights, and where their labor and even their bodies could be exploited with impunity, Sarah represented an opportunity for profit that Dr. Morrison decided to pursue despite the ethical problems that should have been obvious even by the standards of 1866. Beginning in summer 1866, Dr. Morrison began organizing public demonstrations of Sarah's abilities. He placed advertisements in local newspapers and in newspapers in nearby towns, Athens, Augusta, Atlanta, announcing that audiences could witness the remarkable colored girl who never forgets and the Negro child prodigy with perfect memory. He rented halls and charged admission, pricing tickets high enough to generate significant income, but low enough to ensure good attendance. The demonstrations were advertised as both scientific exhibitions and as entertainment, promising audiences that they would witness abilities that defied medical explanation, and that proved the wonders of the human mind. The demonstrations followed a consistent format that Dr. Morrison refined over multiple performances. Sarah would be brought onto a stage where Dr. Morrison would introduce her and would provide brief background about her abilities and about the testing he had conducted. Then audience members would be invited to bring materials forward: books, newspapers, maps, documents, anything they wanted to test Sarah with. Dr. Morrison would show these materials to Sarah briefly, usually for just a few seconds, and would then ask her to recall what she had seen. She would recite text word for word, would describe images in detail, would reproduce maps and diagrams, demonstrating her perfect memory for the amazement of paying audiences. Dr. Morrison would lecture during these demonstrations about the scientific significance of Sarah's abilities, would speculate about the mechanisms that might account for her perfect memory, would sometimes make arguments that her case proved that black people were capable of intellectual achievement, despite what racist theories claimed. But regardless of how he framed these lectures or what arguments he made, the demonstrations were fundamentally exploitative. Sarah was being displayed as a curiosity, a spectacle, an oddity that existed for white entertainment and amazement. She was being used to generate profit that went primarily to Dr. Morrison rather than to Sarah or her mother. She was being subjected to pressure and stress and exhaustion, performing repeatedly for audiences that were often hostile, dealing with the psychological burden of being treated as less than fully human, experiencing the trauma of being stared at and evaluated and discussed as if she were an object rather than a person. Harriet tried to protect her daughter and tried to limit the exploitation, but she had minimal power in this situation. Dr. Morrison controlled access to Sarah during the demonstrations and kept most of the profits for himself, giving Harriet only small payments that were framed as compensation for Sarah's time rather than as fair share of the income her abilities were generating. When Harriet complained or tried to refuse to allow Sarah to participate, Dr. Morrison would threaten to have Sarah taken away through legal mechanisms, would remind Harriet that as a black woman she had no legal standing to resist white authority, would make clear that continued resistance would result in consequences far worse than the exploitation Harriet was trying to prevent. The audiences at these demonstrations were mixed in their reactions, revealing the complex and contradictory attitudes that white Southerners held toward black people and black abilities in the immediate aftermath of slavery. Some audience members were genuinely amazed by Sarah's abilities and were forced to reconsider their assumptions about black intellectual inferiority. They would leave the demonstrations talking about what they had witnessed, questioning whether the racist theories they had been taught could be correct if a black child could demonstrate abilities that exceeded what educated white adults could achieve. For some whites, Sarah's perfect memory was genuinely eye-opening and genuinely challenged their beliefs about race and human potential. But other audience members were suspicious and hostile, assuming that trickery or fraud must be involved because they couldn't accept that a black child could possess abilities that exceeded what most white people could achieve. They would scrutinize Sarah's performances looking for evidence of deception, would bring deliberately difficult or obscure materials to try to catch her making errors, would accuse Dr. Morrison of coaching her, or of having confederates in the audience who provided information through hidden signals. Some would leave the demonstration still convinced that the whole thing was a fraud, their racist beliefs protected from challenge by their refusal to accept evidence that contradicted those beliefs. Still, other audience members were disturbed and threatened by Sarah's gifts, viewing them as unnatural or as evidence of demonic influence or as something that shouldn't exist, regardless of how real the abilities clearly were. They would frame Sarah's memory as unnatural, as something that violated the proper order of creation, as evidence that something was wrong with her rather than as indication of exceptional ability. Some would invoke religious explanations, suggesting that Satan had given Sarah her abilities to deceive people or to challenge divine order, refusing to celebrate or honor abilities in a black child that they would have praised as God-given if demonstrated by a white child. The religious interpretation of Sarah's abilities became increasingly prominent and increasingly problematic as the demonstrations continued through summer and fall of 1866. White ministers began attending the demonstrations and began using Sarah's case in their sermons, though they disagreed dramatically about what her abilities meant and how they should be interpreted. Some ministers preached that Sarah's perfect memory was a gift from God that proved black people were fully human and deserving of equal rights. That God had blessed this child as a sign that black people should be treated with dignity and respect. These ministers used Sarah's case to argue for racial equality and for black advancement, claiming that her abilities were evidence of God's favor toward freed people and proof that claims about black intellectual inferiority were false and sinful. But other ministers preached that Sarah's abilities were unnatural and demonic, that no human being should have such perfect recall of everything they encountered, that her memory was a sign of possession by evil spirits or by Satan himself. They would cite biblical passages about demons and possession, would claim that Sarah's abilities allowed her to access forbidden knowledge, would argue that her perfect memory gave her powers that humans weren't meant to have. These ministers used Sarah's case to argue that black people were inherently connected to evil forces, that freedom had unleashed demonic influences that slavery had kept contained, that Sarah represented the dangers of black autonomy and black development. These theological debates became increasingly heated and increasingly public, with different denominations and different ministers taking opposed positions about what Sarah represented and how her abilities should be understood. Sarah's case became a focal point for broader religious arguments about race, about human nature, about the relationship between the natural and supernatural, about what emancipation meant for the social and spiritual order of Southern society. And through all of these debates, Sarah herself remained voiceless and powerless. A child whose extraordinary gifts had made her the subject of adult conflicts and ideological battles that she couldn't control and couldn't escape from. The turning point that would make Sarah's situation even more dangerous, and that would ultimately lead to the suppression of her case, came in the fall of 1866, when her demonstrations and her perfect memory began to touch on subjects that white society desperately wanted to forget and to suppress. During one demonstration in late October, an audience member, perhaps intending to test Sarah or perhaps genuinely curious about the limits of her abilities, brought forward a page torn from a wartime newspaper about the limits of her abilities. Brought forward a page torn from a wartime newspaper. The page contained an article and an illustration about a lynching that had occurred in Wilkes County in 1863 during the war years, when Confederate authorities and local white vigilantes had used terror and violence to suppress any hint of black resistance or of sympathy for union causes. Dr. Morrison, who hadn't screened the material before it was shown to Sarah, allowed the demonstration to proceed. Sarah looked at the newspaper page briefly for perhaps 5 or 10 seconds. Then, when asked to recall what she had seen, she recited the article word for word in her clear, precise voice that carried to every corner of the hall. The article described how a black man named Joshua had been accused of encouraging other enslaved people to flee to Union lines, how he had been captured by Confederate authorities, how he had been hanged publicly as a warning to others. Sarah recited all of these details exactly as they appeared in the article. Then she described the illustration that accompanied the article, a woodcut showing the lynching scene with multiple figures visible, including the victim and the white men who had carried out the killing. And then Sarah did something that Dr. Morrison hadn't expected and couldn't stop. She began identifying the white men in the illustration, naming them by the names she recognized from her own memories and from stories she had heard in the black community. "That's Mr. Patterson," she said, pointing to where the figure was in her mental image of the illustration. "He ran the general store. And that's Mr. Willis, who owned the plantation north of town. And that's Mr. Carver, who was the sheriff." She continued naming men, identifying them by their roles in the community, describing them from her perfect memory of having seen them around Washington and Wilkes County during her childhood. The audience reaction was immediate, visceral, and hostile. Men who had been at that lynching, or who knew the men Sarah was naming, recognized themselves or their associates in her descriptions. They shouted denials, accused Dr. Morrison of coaching Sarah to make false accusations, accused Sarah herself of lying. Some stood and threatened violence, their faces red with rage. The demonstration ended in chaos, with Dr. Morrison rushing Sarah off the stage while audience members shouted and argued, and while some demanded their money back, claiming they had been brought to witness an educational exhibition, not to be accused of crimes by a black child who couldn't possibly remember events accurately. Dr. Morrison tried to smooth over the incident, tried to claim that Sarah had simply been confused or had been identifying people randomly without any real knowledge of who had been involved in the lynching. But the damage was done. Sarah had revealed that white men wanted forgotten and erased from public record. She had demonstrated that she remembered specific faces, specific names, specific events from her childhood during slavery and during the war years, and that she could testify with perfect accuracy about violence and crimes that white society wanted, buried in the service of reconciliation and moving forward without accountability for past atrocities. After this incident, something shifted in how white society viewed Sarah. She was no longer just an amusing curiosity or a scientific wonder. She was a threat. She was a witness who couldn't be made to forget, who could testify about things that white men had assumed were safely hidden in the past. She was evidence that couldn't be destroyed, and that couldn't be suppressed through the normal mechanisms of intimidation and silencing that white society used to control black testimony. And Sarah herself seemed to understand, perhaps for the first time, what her perfect memory meant in this context. She began spontaneously producing drawings and descriptions during and after the demonstrations, not just reproducing whatever Dr. Morrison showed her, but drawing and describing scenes from her own memories, scenes from slavery, and from the violent early days after emancipation. She would draw faces of white men she had seen participating in whippings, in sexual violence against enslaved women, in theft of property from freed black people. She would recall conversations she had overheard, threats that had been made, names of people who had disappeared, and whose disappearances had never been officially investigated or acknowledged. She drew maps showing locations of unmarked graves where bodies of black people had been buried in secret after being killed by white violence. She named specific plantations and specific white families where she had witnessed or heard about brutal treatment. She recalled details about fraud in labor contracts that were supposed to pay freed people for their work, but that used various tricks to ensure black workers remained in debt. She recalled specific incidents of violence used to suppress black political organizing and black attempts to claim the rights that emancipation was supposed to have granted. She became, through her perfect memory and through her willingness to testify to what she remembered, a living archive of white crimes against black people during slavery and during the violent early years of Reconstruction. Every incident she had witnessed or heard about, every face she had seen, every name she had learned. All of it was stored permanently in her perfect memory and could be recalled and reported with accuracy that couldn't be challenged or discredited through the usual methods of attacking black testimony. This made Sarah extraordinarily dangerous to white power in Georgia in 1866-1867. The Reconstruction period was a time of intense political struggle over what the post-slavery South would become. The federal government and Republican Party were trying to reconstruct Southern society on a basis of black citizenship and political participation and legal equality. But white Southerners were resisting this reconstruction with massive and organized violence, using terror to suppress black voting and black political organizing, using economic coercion to force black people back into labor arrangements that resembled slavery, using legal mechanisms and extralegal violence to restore white supremacy and white control. Central to this white resistance was the need to forget the crimes of slavery and war, to move forward without accountability for what had been done to black people during centuries of enslavement and during the war that had tried to preserve that enslavement. White Southerners needed historical amnesia, needed to be able to rewrite the past as having been less brutal than it was, needed to suppress testimony and evidence that might document what had really happened and who had been responsible. The lost cause mythology that would dominate Southern and American historical memory for a century was already being constructed. Myths about benevolent slavery, about honorable Confederate soldiers fighting for states' rights rather than for slavery, about Reconstruction as corrupt Northern tyranny rather than as attempt to build genuine democracy. Sarah's perfect memory threatened all of this. She was a witness who couldn't be made to forget, who could testify with perfect accuracy about violence and exploitation that white men wanted buried. She was evidence that couldn't be destroyed, and that couldn't be suppressed through intimidation, because her memory was permanent, and because she had already demonstrated publicly that she could recall things that powerful people wanted forgotten. Her very existence challenged the historical forgetting that white supremacy required. Local newspapers that had initially reported on Sarah's demonstrations with fascination and curiosity now stopped mentioning her name. Articles that had been planned about the memory girl were killed by editors who recognized that continued publicity about Sarah and her abilities would create problems for the white power structure. Dr. Morrison, who had been organizing and profiting from Sarah's public appearances, suddenly found himself under intense pressure from local white authorities to stop the demonstrations immediately and to cease drawing attention to the brown girl's memories. He received threats, veiled at first, then increasingly explicit, making clear that continuing to display Sarah and to allow her to testify about what she remembered would result in violence against him and against Sarah and Harriet. White men who had attended the demonstrations and who had been disturbed by Sarah naming names and recalling violence visited Dr. Morrison privately and told him in unmistakable terms that the demonstrations must stop, that Sarah must be silenced, that if he continued to profit from exploiting her memory, he would face consequences that would make him regret ever coming to Georgia. By early 1867, Dr. Morrison had capitulated completely to this pressure. He stopped organizing demonstrations, stopped testing Sarah, stopped talking about her case publicly. By March 1867, he had left Georgia entirely, returning to Pennsylvania and abandoning the work he had been doing with the Freary Edmunds Bureau. He took with him all of his notes and documentation about Sarah's case, all of the detailed records of his testing, all of the measurements and observations, all of the examples of Sarah's perfect recall that he had so meticulously documented. He never published his findings in medical journals as he had initially intended. and as he had promised Harriet he would do. The detailed reports he had written describing Sarah's abilities, which he had told Harriet would help prove black intellectual capacity and would advance the cause of racial equality, were stored away in his private papers and were never submitted for peer review or scholarly discussion. The case that had seemed poised to revolutionize understanding of human memory and that had seemed to offer powerful evidence against scientific racism simply disappeared from scientific discourse, suppressed not through academic critique or through questions about research methodology, but through political and social pressure from whites who couldn't tolerate the implications of Sarah's perfect recall and perfect testimony. Sarah and Harriet were left in Georgia, more vulnerable than before because they were now known to white authorities as sources of dangerous memory and dangerous testimony. The protection that Dr. Morrison's presence and federal authority had provided, minimal as it had been, was gone. They were exposed to retaliation and to violence with no one to protect them or to intervene on their behalf. The black community did what it could to protect them, but resources were limited and the dangers were real and pervasive. They moved from Washington to Augusta in summer 1867, hoping that a larger city might offer more anonymity and more safety. Augusta had a substantial black population, had some federal troops presence that might offer protection, had more opportunities for employment and education. Harriet found work as a laundress, the same backbreaking labor she had been doing in Washington. Sarah continued to attend school when possible, though her formal education was constantly interrupted by the need to work to help support them, and by the general chaos and danger of Reconstruction-era Georgia, where violence against black people was constant, and where black institutions like schools and churches were frequent targets of white terrorism. In Augusta, Sarah came to the attention of a black church community, and specifically of a minister named Reverend Thomas Wilson, who ran a school for freed children in connection with his African Methodist Episcopal Church. Reverend Wilson had heard stories about Sarah's remarkable memory. Stories had spread through black communities despite white efforts to suppress knowledge of Sarah's case, and he was committed to protecting her and to helping her develop her gifts in ways that served the black community, rather than entertaining white audiences or exposing her to danger from whites who feared what she could remember and testify to. Under Reverend Wilson's protection and guidance from 1867 onward, Sarah's education continued and deepened, and her abilities were directed toward purposes that the black community chose rather than purposes that white exploitation imposed. She became a living repository of community history and collective memory. Families who had been separated during slavery would bring her photographs of loved ones they had been separated from, would tell her stories about parents or children or siblings who had been sold away, would share what information they had about where those people might have been taken. Sarah would memorize all of it, the faces in photographs, the names and relationships, the fragments of information about locations and sales and last known whereabouts. She became a human archive, storing information about black families and black history that had no other permanent record, and that would have been lost forever if it had depended solely on written documentation that most black people had no ability or resources to create. Elderly, formerly enslaved people would seek out Sarah to tell her their stories, wanting someone to remember what they had lived through, wanting their experiences to be preserved somewhere, even if white society refused to acknowledge or document the realities of slavery and its aftermath. Sarah would listen with perfect attention and would remember everything: names, dates, places, specific details about work and family and resistance and survival and loss. She could recall these stories years later with perfect accuracy, could answer questions about people and events that had no other documentation, could serve as a living connection to a past that was rapidly being forgotten or deliberately erased by the forces of white historical revisionism that were already beginning to construct the lost cause mythology and to rewrite slavery as benevolent and Reconstruction as tragedy. For several years from 1867 to around 1870, Sarah lived in Augusta and functioned as a community historian and keeper of collective memory, protected by Reverend Wilson's church and by community members who recognized the value and importance of her gifts when they were used to serve Black memory and Black history rather than white curiosity or white profit. She attended school when possible and demonstrated extraordinary academic abilities that went far beyond her perfect memory. She learned to read and write with remarkable speed, progressing from basic literacy to sophisticated reading comprehension in months rather than the years it typically took. She mastered mathematics and geography and history far beyond what would normally be expected for a child her age. Teachers reported that Sarah could read a textbook once and could then answer any question about its contents from memory, that she never needed to review or study material because she retained everything perfectly after a single exposure. She could look at a map in a geography book for a few seconds and could then draw the map from memory, or could answer questions about the locations of cities and rivers and mountain ranges and national borders. She could read a history book once and could recite dates and events and names with perfect accuracy, could recall exact quotations from historical figures, could describe illustrations, and could even reproduce them by drawing. By age 12 in 1870, Sarah had completed what would normally be considered a primary education and had begun studying more advanced subjects, algebra and geometry, Latin grammar, works of literature and history, that would typically be taught only to much older students in the elite schools that educated white children for university. Her teachers were amazed by her abilities and were convinced that she could excel at the highest levels of education if she could access opportunities that were almost entirely closed to Black students, especially Black female students in the South. But even within the relative safety of Reverend Wilson's church and the Black community in Augusta, Sarah could not be entirely protected from white attention and white threats. Stories about her perfect memory continued to circulate, transmitted through the networks of communication that existed despite white efforts to control information. Some whites were simply curious and wanted to witness Sarah's abilities for themselves, but others viewed her as a continuing threat. Someone whose memory preserved testimony about crimes that needed to remain hidden. Someone whose abilities challenged white supremacist ideology in ways that couldn't be tolerated. In 1870, when Sarah was 12 years old, there was a serious attempt by white authorities to have her forcibly taken for medical examination by white doctors who wanted to study her brain, and who spoke openly about their desire to perform an autopsy after her death to determine whether there were physical differences in her brain structure that might account for her abilities. This wasn't pure scientific curiosity. It was part of broader efforts by white scientists and physicians to find biological justification for racial hierarchy, to identify physical differences between Black and white brains that could be used to justify claims about Black intellectual inferiority. The fact that Sarah demonstrated abilities that exceeded what most white people could achieve was threatening to these theories, and needed to be explained in ways that didn't challenge racial hierarchy. Some white physicians theorized that Sarah's perfect memory might be associated with brain abnormalities or defects that made her exceptional, but also made her less than fully human in other ways. They wanted to examine her, to measure her, to document her in ways that would allow them to explain her abilities, without having to acknowledge that a Black child possessed genuine genius that couldn't be explained away through racist frameworks. The Black community successfully resisted this attempt through collective action and through armed defense. When white authorities came to Reverend Wilson's church looking for Sarah, they found the building surrounded by Black men who made clear that they would use force to prevent Sarah from being taken. Reverend Wilson negotiated with the authorities, invoking federal law and Freary Edmunds Bureau authority, making legal arguments about Sarah's rights, and about the illegality of forcibly taking her for medical examination without her consent or her mother's consent. The authorities eventually backed down, but the threat remained clear. Sarah was not safe, would never be truly safe as long as she remained in the South, where her perfect memory was viewed as dangerous, and where black people had insufficient power to protect their own from white violence and exploitation. The decision was made by Harriet, by Reverend Wilson, and by other black community leaders that Sarah needed to leave the South entirely. In 1871, arrangements were made to send Sarah north to Philadelphia, where she could live with a family connected to the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and where she could attend the Institute for Colored Youth, a prestigious black educational institution that provided classical education to black students, and that had a reputation for academic excellence, and for preparing students for professional careers, and for leadership roles in the black community. Harriet remained in Augusta. She couldn't afford to travel north, couldn't find employment there that would allow her to support herself, had her entire life and her limited social networks in Georgia, despite all the dangers and difficulties that entailed. The separation from her daughter was agonizing for both of them. Harriet was sending away the child she had worked so hard to protect and educate, would not see her grow up, would not be present for all the milestones and achievements that she had hoped her daughter would experience. But she also understood that staying in the South would likely mean Sarah's abilities would be suppressed, would mean Sarah would face continuing danger and exploitation, would mean that the extraordinary gifts Sarah possessed would never be fully developed or used in ways that honored their significance. Sarah and Harriet maintained contact through letters after Sarah moved to Philadelphia. Harriet, who had learned basic literacy in the years since emancipation, would write to her daughter in careful, labored handwriting, and Sarah would respond with letters that demonstrated her increasingly sophisticated education and her continuing love for her mother. But they would never see each other again in person. Harriet died in 1879 from lung disease that resulted from years of breathing smoke and chemicals from laundry work. Sarah received news of her mother's death weeks after it occurred, too late to return for the funeral. Even if she had been able to afford the journey, the grief of losing her mother while separated by hundreds of miles, of never having had the chance to say goodbye, of knowing that Harriet died without seeing her daughter one final time. This grief Sarah carried for the rest of her life, preserved with perfect clarity in her perfect memory, just like everything else she experienced. In Philadelphia, Sarah attended the Institute for Colored Youth from 1871 to 1876, receiving an education that was excellent by any standard, and that was extraordinary by the standards of what was available to black students anywhere in America. The Institute's faculty were highly educated black teachers and white Quaker supporters who were committed to providing rigorous classical education to black students, teaching Latin and Greek, and advanced mathematics and sciences and literature and history, preparing students to become teachers and ministers and professionals who could serve and lead the black community. Teachers at the Institute were amazed by Sarah's abilities from her first days at the school. She consistently scored perfectly on examinations, never missing a question or making an error. She could recite entire books from memory after reading them once. She could master complex subjects, higher mathematics, Latin grammar, scientific principles, after single exposures to material that other students needed weeks or months of study to learn. She excelled particularly in languages, learning Latin and French, and beginning Greek with a speed and facility that suggested she would be able to master any language she chose to study. But Sarah's time in Philadelphia also revealed the limitations and the burdens of her perfect memory in ways that became increasingly clear as she grew older and as she accumulated more experiences and more memories. She could not forget anything. Not just the academic material she studied for school, but also every painful experience, every trauma, every violence she had witnessed or experienced during slavery and during Reconstruction. Her memory preserved everything with perfect fidelity and perfect permanence. The brutalities of slavery that most people would gradually forget, or would process and integrate in ways that made them less overwhelming remained perfectly vivid in Sarah's recall. She could remember specific instances of violence against her mother, specific threats from white men, specific scenes of suffering that she had witnessed as a young child. These memories didn't fade or become less painful over time. They remained as clear and as distressing as if they were happening in the present. Faculty and students at the institute reported that Sarah would sometimes become overwhelmed by her memories, would have episodes where she seemed to be experiencing past traumas as if they were happening in the present moment, would struggle to distinguish between memory and current reality when her recall was so vivid and so complete that remembering felt subjectively identical to experiencing. She would sometimes freeze in the middle of activities, her expression vacant, clearly seeing something that no one else could see. And when she returned to awareness of her present surroundings, she would be shaking and distressed, having just relived some terrible memory with perfect clarity. Modern psychology would recognize these symptoms as consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder, though that diagnostic category didn't exist in the 1870s. And Sarah received no treatment or therapeutic support for the psychological burden her perfect memory created. Faculty tried to be supportive and understanding, but they had no framework for addressing the unique suffering that came from being unable to forget trauma, from having every painful memory preserved with permanent clarity, from lacking the natural forgetting and gradual fading of traumatic memory that allows most people to process and recover from terrible experiences over time. Sarah graduated from the Institute for Colored Youth in 1876 at age 18, having completed an education that would have been impressive for any student. And that was extraordinary given her circumstances, and given the limited educational opportunities that existed for black students even in the North. She was qualified to teach, to continue in higher education, if such opportunities existed for black women, which they largely didn't in 1876, to contribute to black intellectual and cultural life in ways that would have honored her abilities and would have used her gifts for purposes she chose. But there are essentially no records of what happened to Sarah Brown after her graduation from the Institute in 1876. She disappears from the historical record almost completely. No marriage record, no death certificate, no employment records, no further correspondence or documentation of any kind that has been discovered despite extensive searches by historians who became interested in her case. It's as if she vanished, as if her existence simply ended when she was 18 years old, as if the person who possessed perfect memory and extraordinary intellectual abilities left no trace of her own continued life after that point. This disappearance from historical record is itself deeply mysterious and troubling. Several possibilities exist, none of them definitively provable with available evidence. Sarah might have died young, perhaps from illness or perhaps from suicide, if the burden of her perfect memory and her inability to forget trauma became unbearable. Black women in the 1870s had high mortality rates, and their deaths often went unrecorded or were recorded in ways that didn't connect to their earlier lives, making it possible that Sarah died without leaving documentary evidence that historians could later find and connect to her. Alternatively, Sarah might have deliberately erased her own presence from historical record, adopting a new name and a new identity to escape the attention and the dangers that her abilities had attracted throughout her life. This wouldn't have been unusual. Many black people changed their names after emancipation, either to mark the transition to freedom or to escape from past associations or to protect themselves from ongoing dangers. If Sarah had chosen to live under a different name and had chosen not to display her perfect memory abilities publicly, she could have lived a long life that left no documentary trace connecting her to the Sarah Brown who attended the Institute for Colored Youth. She might have married and taken her husband's name, might have moved to a different city or state where she wasn't known, might have deliberately chosen obscurity and privacy over public recognition. Given how much suffering her perfect memory had caused her, The exploitation by Dr. Morrison, the threats from whites who feared her testimony, the constant pressure of being treated as spectacle rather than as person, the burden of being unable to forget trauma. It would be entirely understandable if Sarah had chosen to hide her abilities and to live as anonymously as possible, or something might have happened to her. Violence, exploitation, institutional confinement. If her episodes of being overwhelmed by traumatic memory were misunderstood as insanity, that removed her from circumstances where she would leave documentary evidence. The 1870s and 1880s were periods of intense racial violence and oppression in both North and South. Black people who stood out in any way, who challenged racial hierarchies through their abilities or their achievements, who possessed knowledge or capabilities that threatened white supremacy. Such people were targets for violence and for suppression. Sarah's perfect memory had already made her a target multiple times. It's possible that she met a fate that was never properly recorded or that was deliberately hidden. We will probably never know with certainty what happened to Sarah Brown after 1876. What we do know is that her case was never properly documented or studied by the white scientific and medical establishment, that her extraordinary abilities were exploited rather than honored during her childhood, that she was endangered rather than protected, and that ultimately she was forgotten by the dominant society that had briefly found her useful and then had found her too dangerous to remember. The fragmentary evidence of Sarah's life and abilities that has been preserved comes from several sources that were maintained by the Black community, and that were rediscovered by historians beginning in the 1980s, when scholars became interested in uncovering suppressed stories from Reconstruction-era Black history. A photograph exists taken in 1866 showing a small black girl in a plain dress standing in front of a wooden church. This is believed to be Sarah, though the photograph carries no identifying information beyond a handwritten note on the back saying, "Memory Girl, Washington, Georgia, 1866. The photograph shows a child with an intense, serious expression, standing very still and straight, looking directly at the camera with eyes that seem older than her years. Letters preserved in the archives of the African Methodist Episcopal Church include references to the brown girl from Georgia, who remembers everything and discussions among church leaders about protecting her and ensuring her education. A letter from Reverend Wilson to church officials in Philadelphia includes this passage. "We are sending you a child of exceptional gifts who requires protection and education beyond what we can provide here. She possesses perfect memory and has suffered greatly from those who would exploit such ability. She carries also the wounds of slavery and of violence witnessed, and will require patience and understanding as she develops her remarkable capabilities." Most significantly, a journal kept by Reverend Thomas Wilson, discovered in a church archive in Augusta in the 1980s, contains extensive descriptions of Sarah's abilities and discussions of how the Black community worked to protect her, and to use her memory to preserve family histories and community knowledge. The journal includes this striking passage written in 1869. "The child Sarah remembers everything, every face, every name, every story that is told to her. She has become our living archive, preserving the memories of our people that no written record captures. But she carries also a terrible burden, for she cannot forget the horrors she has witnessed. She remembers slavery with perfect clarity, remembers violence and suffering that most have mercy of forgetting gradually. I pray that her gift, which is also her curse, might serve some larger purpose that makes her suffering meaningful way." And there is the letter from Martha Williams, Sarah's first teacher, written to a colleague in Philadelphia in 1867. This letter, discovered in the papers of a Quaker missionary family, discusses Sarah's case with striking insight. They fear what she remembers. It is not the child they flee from. It is the history she carries in her head. She is living testimony to crimes they wish to forget, to violence they wish to deny, to humanity in Black people they wish to suppress. In a nation desperate to forget its sins and to move forward without accountability, a girl who cannot forget becomes the greatest threat of all. She preserves truth that power wishes buried, and truth is always dangerous to those whose authority depends upon lies and historical erasure. See modern historians and psychologists who have studied the fragmentary evidence of Sarah Brown's case recognize that she almost certainly possessed genuine eidetic or photographic memory of a kind that is extremely rare, and that remains poorly understood even by contemporary neuroscience and psychology. True eidetic memory, the ability to recall sensory information with perfect fidelity, as if viewing an internal image or recording is distinguished from simply excellent memory, or from trained memory techniques by the accuracy, the permanence, and the automatic nature of the recall. Sarah's abilities, as documented in contemporary sources, seem to represent authentic eidetic memory rather than simply exceptional memory skills. The descriptions of her being able to recite entire pages of text after viewing them for seconds, of reproducing complex images with perfect fidelity, of recalling information perfectly after single exposures without any effort at memorization. These all point toward genuine photographic memory rather than toward learned techniques or exceptional, but still fundamentally normal memory abilities. The case also reveals the particular dangers and burdens that faced exceptionally gifted Black individuals in Reconstruction-era America and in the decades that followed. Sarah's abilities should have been celebrated, should have opened doors to education and opportunity, should have made her life richer and more successful. Instead, her gifts made her a target for exploitation by whites who saw her as source of profit or as scientific curiosity. Her perfect memory made her dangerous to whites who needed to suppress Black testimony about slavery and about Reconstruction violence. Her abilities challenged racist ideology in ways that threatened white supremacy, and that made her existence intolerable to white power structures. The suppression of her case, the way that Dr. Morrison's documentation was never published, the way that newspaper coverage stopped when her memories began touching on white crimes, the way that she disappeared from historical record after leaving the South. All of this reveals how threats to racial hierarchy were systematically suppressed regardless of their scientific or historical significance. Sarah Brown's story also highlights the political nature of memory and of historical preservation. Who gets to remember whose memories are preserved and whose are erased? What happens when a society's need to forget its need to rewrite history in ways that serve current power relations comes into conflict with individuals whose memories will not cooperate with collective amnesia? Sarah's perfect memory made her a threat precisely because she could not be made to forget, could not be convinced that events had happened differently than she remembered, could not be silenced through the normal mechanisms of historical revision and erasure that allowed white society to construct the lost cause mythology and to suppress testimony about the realities of slavery and Reconstruction violence. In the end, Sarah Brown was defeated not by the limitations of her own abilities, but by the society that could not tolerate her gifts. She deserved celebration, protection, opportunity to develop her extraordinary memory in ways that served purposes she chose. Instead, she faced exploitation, danger, and ultimately erasure. Her story stands as one of countless examples of how Black genius and Black testimony have been systematically suppressed throughout American history when they threatened white power and white historical narratives. What do you think of Sarah Brown's story? Do you believe she truly possessed photographic memory as the evidence suggests? Why do you think her case was suppressed? And why did she disappear from historical record? Have you heard stories in your family about individuals with extraordinary abilities who were exploited rather than celebrated? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story important and moving, subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell and share this video with others who need to understand that Black history contains countless stories of extraordinary people whose gifts were suppressed, whose testimonies were silenced, and whose very existence was erased when their abilities or their memories threatened white power. Remember that Sarah Brown's perfect memory should have been a blessing, but became a burden because she lived in a society that could not tolerate the truth she remembered, and that would rather destroy black genius than acknowledge that it existed, and that it challenged every racist assumption about black inferiority. Honor her memory by refusing to forget her story and by committing to preserving and sharing.